So now on the opposite end, genetic engineering. So they use something called genetic insertion, gene insertion. They use a gene gun. That's one of the...
A gene gun?
Yeah. The more technical name is a biolistic particle delivery system.
I like gene gun.
Yeah.
Let's go with that one.
That was good.
This is Generation Health. Every week we bring you the latest in news, cutting-edge research, and time-tested best practices helping you live a longer, healthier life. Josiah Schweinberg, you grinning at me back there, throwing me off. I'm going to announce you first. Third mic is Josiah Schweinberg, engineer extraordinaire.
Star of the show.
I was looking to see how hard Joey was working as you were opening the show, and I was like, wow, he's really going at that keyboard.
Look, he doesn't waste time.
Last minute.
Joey DiMatteo, PharmD, board certified clinical nutritionist. How are you, my friend?
Very good, Tyler. How are you?
I'm good. My name is Tyler Andrews. I'm the host. What are we talking about, Joey?
Today we're talking about GMOs.
Hey!
Little bit of a continuation of the last few that we've discussed. We're basically regarding concerns in our food.
Absolutely.
Not so much the ingredients, but any types of additives, organic, pesticide, GMOs.
Makes sense. But first, I'm going to talk about what's happening behind the counter. The EPA has finalized a rule banning most uses of a chemical solvent most commonly used as a paint stripper. Methylene chloride has caused at least 88 deaths among workers involved in bathtub refinishing and other painting stripping due to what they called sudden exposure since the 1980s. Some of these deaths occurred even when workers were well-trained and used protective equipment. But that's not all. The EPA went on to say it poses an, quote, unreasonable health risk, unquote, of neurotoxicity from both short-term exposure as well as liver toxicity and liver and lung cancer from long-term exposure. In other words, this is some really nasty stuff. In addition to paint stripping, methylene chloride is used in some adhesives, metal cleaning, chemical processing, aerosols, and even pharmaceuticals. While the rule bans it in most applications, it's not completely banned. Current exceptions include production of other chemicals, electric battery manufacturing, that's pretty useful these days, solvent welding, plastic and rubber manufacturing, among others. Additional worker protections will be in place, but that's still a really long list of uses for this supposedly banned chemical. And how about some good news? Professor Richard Scolyer just received confirmation that his one-year brain scan shows it is cancer-free. His brain is cancer-free. Scolyer is a world-renowned pathologist who, along with his research partner, Georgina Long, made incredible breakthroughs in treating melanoma with immunotherapy, or harnessing the body's own ability to fight cancer. Previously, patients with advanced melanoma had less than 10% chance of beating the disease, but that number is now over 50% thanks to their research. But Tyler, what does melanoma have to do with brain cancer? Well, not much, but that was why it was so devastating when Professor Scolyer was diagnosed with a glioblastoma a couple of years ago. The subtype of brain cancer that he was diagnosed with is so aggressive that the survival rate is typically less than 1 year. When faced with this prognosis, after talking with his care team and fellow cancer experts, he decided he wanted to treat his tumor with the same techniques that he had pioneered in melanoma. In his words, it was a no-brainer. Now, having received this 1-year scan, the professor's brain shows no signs of cancer. Quote, "It certainly doesn't mean that my brain cancer is cured, but it's just nice to know that it hasn't come back yet. So I've still got some time to enjoy my life with my wife, Katie, and my 3 wonderful kids." That was Professor Scolyer.
Wow.
Obviously, this is a long way from being used in other patients, but this success means clinical trials are probably not too far off in the future. This is a big deal. One of the other things he talked about in one of his articles was how glioblastoma care hadn't really changed much in the last 20 years. They were using the same protocols and the same treatments and had the same not great results, which is why he was like, well, what's the risk? Worst thing that happens is he dies. And he was already thinking that was going to happen anyway. So very, very exciting that we may have a major breakthrough in that area. All right. That's what I've got. Now let's talk about GMOs. What is a GMO?
Yeah, so we'll start with the definition and then as you'll see here, some of these definitions need sub-definitions. But so a genetically modified organism, or GMO, is any organism whose genetic material has been altered using genetic engineering.
Okay.
Another definition, actually by the UN, is a plant is genetically modified if it meets two requirements. One, the plant contains a novel combination of genetic material. Two, it was introduced by using modern biotechnology.
Okay.
So we'll differentiate, what some of this actually means here. But genetic engineering, one of those sub definitions, the definition varies somewhat, but it's an organism that is altered in a way that does not occur naturally by mating and or natural recombination. Which is the natural exchange of DNA material between male and female chromosomes in the production of offspring.
Okay, so right off the bat, that means we're not talking about selective breeding.
Exactly. Selective breeding or artificial selection is not genetic engineering, so it's not included in any definition of GMO. The key point there that really differentiates this is artificial selection selects for traits that are already present in a given species. Genetic engineering creates new traits in the species.
Got it.
That's the
For years, I was confused about that because I always learned about
the old genetics class.
Exactly. You learn about it in high school of like this monk started taking these bean plants and crossbreeding them, and I always thought that was the same thing, and I was very confused as to why this was a big deal.
So non-GMO is not a lack of science. It's not a lack of human intervention. It just has a very explicit definition of what the difference is.
So you can selectively breed your corn for lower water need.
Yeah.
But that's a much slower, longer process.
And much more natural process.
Got it.
Yes. You're not introducing new DNA to produce new proteins to make it resistant to a given pesticide.
Got it.
That's
okay. All right.
So now on the opposite end, genetic engineering, another one of those sub-definitions. So it's the modification and manipulation of an organism's genes using technology.
Okay.
So this was new to me in terms of what that actually means. So they use something called genetic insertion, gene insertion. So this was kind of mind blowing. They called it, they use a gene gun. That's one of the...
A gene gun?
Yeah. The more technical name is a biolistic particle delivery system.
I like gene gun.
Yeah.
Let's go with that one.
That was good. It delivers DNA into cells. They coat it with a heavy metal. So they coat the particles and literally just inject it and shoot it into cells so that this DNA will then produce the protein that is desired.
Okay, so does that mean that this DNA is then part of the genetic code of that cell?
No, not necessarily.
It's almost like a second entity within it.
It can be. They could, have corn plants that are producing XYZ, but more than likely, it's coming, and very often, it's coming from a different species. That they know that this DNA codes for this protein. They work backwards.
Okay, yeah.
What is increasing yield? What is preventing, this pest from killing these crops? They work backwards. It's this protein, which then is coded by this DNA. Let's extract it. Let's use our gene gun and gene insertion.
Okay.
And then there's one more level to it. There's a promoter that must be included to make the gene express itself. Express literally just means for it to produce proteins, contribute to the phenotype or the observable traits of that organism and the desired code that you just injected into it.
Okay, so in people, we talk about gene expression like sometimes stress can change the gene expression, or substance abuse, or cancer, or all those different things. Adiposity, those can all change gene expression.
Yeah.
You're talking about that sort of thing, but artificially done within the plant.
What you're describing is true. It's just much more complicated. There could be a lot of factors.
Right.
Maybe there's a code written in for substance abuse or something like that, but there's a lot of factors that would come into play to have that end up being expressed and to manifest.
Okay.
Something like this is much more... It's crazy to have gone over all this and say black and white or simple.
Right.
But this DNA makes this protein to give us X effect. We know we can inject it. How do we make sure it's going to make that protein? Because it's from a different
And
plant or
what'd
whatever.
you call it?
A promoter.
A promoter,
And
okay.
they are from viruses.
Oh, lovely.
The depth of that I didn't go into, but they are that is what they use to make sure that this gene expresses itself.
Wow.
So that's in terms of what's practical and relevant. That is the difference between what's genetically modified by the definition with genetic engineering versus the old stuff we learn in class of, we want blue eyes, that kind of thing,
right?
Where you just combine, that's natural
or
selection.
Like dog breeds.
Yes.
We breed for specific traits and that's how we know it. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, you can have ethical or other concerns about that. But we're still really talking here about plants and there's no proof that is problematic at all. That's just people trying to improve production, et cetera.
Okay. So why do we do this in the first place? What's the goal of genetically modifying an organism?
Yeah. The goals are similar to what we talked about with pesticides, to increase yield, to make larger, more meat heavy animals, to make certain plants more resistant to a pesticide in general or in a given area. So it's all about increasing the quality, at least in the most macro of sense, the quality and the yield, which those are all just details too. If less is being killed, yield's better. If the product itself is larger, yield's better. All of those things. So why it's done is very apparent. It's at the end of the day. I was going to say at the end of the day, like so many of these things, it's money. And this is not, you're using high level science and scientists. And so this is not a cheap process to engage in. That's a whole kind of other issues. Mainly who's doing this are the biggest of the big, who's doing it in larger volume are the biggest of the big. And then you introduce potentially some other issues, beyond even the GMO itself, potentially. That's
fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So that's why they do it. That makes sense. Go ahead.
So in the last 25 years, genetically modified crop production has experienced a 100-fold increase. This was from a study in 2017.
Wow.
190 million hectares of biotech, of GMO crops, are currently being farmed in the U.S., which is equivalent to nearly the entire surface of Mexico.
Wow.
That was mind-blowing. So
that's in the U.S.? So, we're talking about, that's the majority.
I'm sorry, it's worldwide. It doesn't explicitly say that, but it has to be worldwide.
I was going to say,
I'm sorry. Yeah.
Almost everything we're growing.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Worldwide makes a little more sense.
Yes.
Okay.
So now breaking that down, soy is 50% of that. The soybean oil, all the different uses for soy. Cotton is 13% of that. We're obviously not consuming cotton. Corn or maize is 30% of that. We're using some of that now for ethanol. So it's not like automatically all this is tomatoes but still it's just showing broadly what the volume of this is. This isn't some minor factor in terms of what we eat. Now, how important it is, we'll try to unpack that a little bit. But in terms of the scope of it, it's overtaken. It's massive.
That's amazing. Okay. And yeah, that makes sense. I don't care if you genetically modify what goes in my gas tank. That's fine.
Exactly.
But I care a little bit more what goes inside of me. All right.
Exactly.
All right. Keep talking.
Yeah. So from a regulation standpoint, I always find this interesting when we're talking about more of a kind of a controversial type subject where we're not 100% sure. You may have your own opinion, but it's not conclusive whether something is good or bad or okay. So the European Union, for example, has much more specific regulations in place for GMO products and also animals fed GMO food.
Okay.
So each individual product must be individually authorized and approved. So you can't just this is our corn and we're going to sell it. You cannot do that. Some actual countries within the EU have instituted bans entirely. They've also instituted their own individual bans, or maybe it was approved by the EU. They allowed GMOs, but they're not going to allow this individual product. So it would take a while to go through all the differences in terms of the specifics, but it is very interesting just to know as I'm trying to prepare a podcast here for this topic, how difficult it is. You've got all these different countries have their own opinions, their own scientists in terms of what they're doing about it. So it's a difficult subject for sure, to unpack and to figure out exactly what you do. For
sure. And especially you said it, including what's fed to livestock.
Yes.
Because that's a whole other subject.
Yes. That's not as, from a U.S. standpoint, is not really a focus of theirs until you get to the organic definition. But prior to that, that's not, if it's not going into human consumption, it's kind of in its own bucket. So EU is just going to be a little tighter in that regard.
Okay.
And one other interesting fact regarding this, 30% of all GMO crops are produced, guess where? Here.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Yes. The biggest businesses, a lot of land. It's no surprise. So one issue with the way that we here in the U.S. regulate GMOs is that it's very fragmented. So an individual agency, depending on what the product is, can have different regulations. So the FDA may say one thing, the EPA may say another thing, the USDA has a different standard. So it's very fragmented here. The EU and also Canada are very specific. Another thing that I found very interesting, and I was not aware of, surprisingly, beginning in January 1st of 2022, foods must be labeled as GMO. Now, they use a very small seal, like makes it look like a little patch, a little seal, or a little text, and they use the term bioengineering. So they fought the GMO label as a little bit more of a buzzword. They prefer bioengineer. I don't know that sounds better to me.
Yes.
But these big time companies and lawyers thought so. So that's approved. So when you see that,
they did test marketing and stuff. So
exactly.
Okay. So bioengineered, if you see that on the packaging of your food, what that means is it contains GMO produce of some variety.
Yes.
Oh, I see it. I just pulled up a picture.
And that's what surprised me is I can't picture seeing it. I don't know how. It's been 2 years now, but maybe it's just, again, because it's like a little seal thing. Like there's 6 of those seals on all these foods. Maybe I just miss it, but I'm going to look for it now for sure.
It looks like a cornfield. I wish I turned my computer on, but I want to risk unplugging
I appreciate that.
the audio and the microphones, but it looks like cornfield, like little emblem. It doesn't look harmful at all.
I was going to say, it makes it look nice and it makes it look like, wow.
So it's almost being presented as if, hey, look, this one is GMO.
Yeah.
This one is bioengineered.
Woo!
So that sheds a little more light on why they kind of fought this. So all right, we'll follow this, but we need to be able to do this, and it's going to look this way. And
I'll tell you what, it looks a lot better than the non-GMO verified label.
Wow. That's interesting. Okay. All right. Great. Okay. So you said it was 2022.
Mm-hmm.
So it's on there now. That's good to know.
Yes.
Bioengineered. Lovely.
Yeah. So just to kind of wrap up the international flair here, Canada has a very specific, what I found interesting was traits and targets. So if the original product, that they evaluate its allergenicity and toxicity.
Okay.
And then if there's a 20 or 30% increase, the product is banned. So they do it by a specific number. So if they, again, I just to unpack all this, if they find it's 5% or 10% or 15%, it's approved. Does that mean it's something that you want to eat if you can avoid? That's where it gets, a little tricky. They also, certain GMOs must be classified if they have a novel trait. So basically, if this trait that's been introduced is not a part of the plant at all in any area, then they must submit to their own type of FDA for they call it an environmental release.
Okay.
So it's just a much more stringent approach to dealing with this. So, again, here in the U.S., the FDA has concluded broadly that GMOs are safe.
Interesting. Okay. So then where's the controversy? If it's safe, why are all these countries banning it or restricting it? Why do we have all these regulations? What's the concern here?
So the concern definitely stems, I feel, at least initially, from the optics of this. I mean, when you're thinking about what we just spoke about, if you have a choice between that being done to the food you eat and not, I think that's, kind of spells out at least initial concern.
It just looks bad.
Yes. And again, you are definitely you're having these plants produce proteins that they don't normally make.
Right.
So it's kind of one of those things of where theoretically there could be issues because you're altering some gene expression. You're injecting genes. So where it does become somewhat more difficult is like you're asking, is parsing out exactly what occurs. The main concerns, whether theoretical or with a small study or a larger study, whatever the case may be, involve allergies, cancer, GI and bowel issues. And then kind of on the other side here, it's important, but we're still mainly talking about consumption, but environmental issues.
Okay. All right.
So from an environmental standpoint, there are definitely concerns, and there's certainly a lot of regulatory pushback or, people being very upset about what it can do. There's a higher increase, and this is definitely dovetails into our concerns too, but there's a net increase in herbicide use. So it fosters the growth of herbicide-resistant weeds, and generally negatively impacts just the entire ecosystem. That can affect the animals around and things like that. So
is that because if you're engineering the plant to be more herbicide resistant, then you feel safer hosing that sucker down, which then leads to the weeds and everything else becoming more resistant in an effort to survive?
Yes.
Oh, that's cool. I can see how that would be a problem long term.
Yes.
Cool. Wonderful. All right.
So this is one example. And again, just to kind of get back to the basics here. If the focus is, oh my goodness, they're injecting genes and that this stuff is terrible and it's bad for me, that's fine. But ultimately what it's doing again is making that DNA produce a given protein. So this is obviously anecdotal, but it goes along with what the concerns would be from an allergy standpoint. So in 2000, there was a California woman. She went into anaphylactic shock after eating corn tacos from a large taco chain. Maybe you can guess what that would be.
Yeah.
So what happened here? So anaphylactic shock. She had exposure to corn her entire life, never an issue. All of a sudden, she eats corn tortillas,
right,
and has anaphylactic shock. So what they found, because she could tie it to this chain, was that there was a pest repelling protein, CRY9C. Okay. It is a bacteria that's naturally found in soil. Okay. And it destroys in insect intestines. Okay. So basically it's a pesticide. It's a natural bacterial pesticide. So what was done, and again, that's some kind of, I think this ties everything together. So what they did was they said, hey, we know this bacteria produces this protein. So we're not going to put this bacteria in there. We're going to put in the DNA, the part that codes for the production of the protein. So they put that in corn. Now, regulations here did a pretty decent job. They banned it in human use, but they allowed it for animal feeding because they found that there were digestive issues, not in animals that consumed it, but in humans that did consume it. But what happened was, this is where kind of human error and nature taking over.
Yeah.
They were planted, they're called Starlink corn.
Okay.
Branded. Starlink corn was planted close enough to human use unmodified crops. Cross-pollination occurred. So over time, there was enough cross-pollination that, back to the basics of genetics, that then now the corn that was not supposed to be able to produce this protein now can. This was large scale, going to this large taco chain. And so she consumed corn tortillas that were produced with this Starlink corn because of the cross-contamination. So even where regulation essentially works, exactly, there's still just this issue of humans still having to navigate this. And then when nature kind of take over in these types of situations.
I remember hearing about something similar about some GMO crops that were found in a farmer's field. And then the farmer got sued because of it was the cross pollination, and the big company said, "You're using our grain," and he was like, "No." But because it drifted over on the wind, he ended up getting in trouble.
Wow. Yeah, and then that's
Because
exactly
it was copywritten, trademarked, whatever genetic code that they had created.
Wow. I mean, that's similar to what happened here. Hopefully there wasn't any fallout like there was for this poor lady.
Gee
How do they
whiz.
recall? So I'm reading the article about this woman.
Mm-hmm.
It says GMO corn was planted too close to the unmodified crops, and the tortillas that she ate were soon recalled due to the contamination from the GMO product.
Wow.
How do you go about recalling all of those tortilla shells and knowing like which ones?
Yeah.
You're just about to just wipe the whole inventory.
I assume they track, this batch from this place has this serial number on it, and this batch from this place. They're able to track
any
it.
company that's farming corn at that level is massive. They call their corn Starlink. I mean, that's
yeah.
Sounds like Skynet.
I think they have large ambitions.
Well, Starlink is the name of Elon Musk's global internet satellite internet
is
thing.
it Starlink? Yeah, it is.
Yeah. So it's corn and internet.
Took it.
It's internet corn.
And internet. So again, that was anecdotal, but it does really tie in from the conceptual process of what these GMOs are meant to do and what potentially the issue can be. So we're not seeing that though in a large scale in the sense of there weren't thousands and thousands of people. So this, what we'll get to and what ultimately I think comes of this is if you want to label GMOs as bad broadly, that's your prerogative, but these are all individually produced items.
Yeah.
This was a very, very specific corn made to do something very specific. So you can't necessarily say, well, look, this protein did this. So then automatically GMOs then cause that. So again, just trying to keep it in the large scale of what these things are, but then pin down everyday life, what can occur both in the good and in the not plausible or not likely to occur.
Right. Okay.
Because there's kind of the other way too. There are scientists that are working on, and it's kind of in its early stages, but just like the process of basically getting a organism to produce a protein that's not native to it, that can be allergenic, like in this case, the opposite can occur. If they can kind of delete or get rid of or stop expression of known allergenic proteins in food, it can be a longer term solution to some of the large scale allergies that we have. So it can work backwards.
Like allergy safe peanuts.
Exactly.
Wow. Okay,
Yeah.
that's kind of cool.
Mm-hmm. So long term, it is posited that could be a potential solution.
Interesting.
So again, regarding some of the issues, there was this was like the early 2010s that got a lot of attention. There was a study done that they found they gave corn, 3 different varieties of GMO corn to rats for 90 days. And they found that there was kidney and liver impairment. Okay. So, I mean, the study is what it is, though. There are some potential flaws. The amount of corn that these rats were given. Rats aren't typically just eating tons of corn. Yeah. Pesticide residue, like we talked about, GMOs are much more likely to have that higher pesticide residue. So you're putting a lot of burden on a rat in that case. And these similar studies were done in humans, and they could not, fortunately, duplicate those results. So again, this is another situation with these where there's smoke, but it's hard to definitely attribute, now GMOs are causing liver failure.
Got it.
Okay. So that's, again, that was linked. This study was linked in multiple kind of more broad articles I was looking at. So at least did want to mention it. It is significant, does have value. It is leading to more research, but it's far from conclusive that that's going to be, carry over into humans. Okay.
All right. So that's the allergen element of this. What about the cancer side of things? What information is there about all that?
So another, I would say significant, like when you start just looking up, Googling basic things like, are GMOs bad, problems with GMOs, related to gut issues. There is a specific bacteria, again, a bacteria found in soil that functions as an insecticide. It's a different one, but it's a Bacillus thuringiensis. Okay. So in the 90s,
It's one of my favorites.
Yeah, in the 90s, potatoes, corn, and soy were all kind of in large scale genetically engineered to produce this protein, natural insecticides. So what's occurring naturally, the soil has this protein in it. It's limiting to some extent, this bacteria in it, it's limiting to some extent these given insects.
Sure.
Well, now they figured, okay, so if we can get the crop itself to produce this, so now the crop itself is producing this now is in the end product, not just in the soil it's come into contact with.
Right.
So studies, very specific studies were done in rats again, regarding this issue, and they were looking for any issues. And what they found with this specific bacteria was intestinal issues, intestinal perforations, major, intestinal damage. So again, this is not a one-to-one, this is the cause, but since the late 70s, we know there's been a massive increase in inflammatory bowel diseases, Crohn's, ulcerative colitis, IBS. Again, I'm not saying that this is the cause and stop GMOs, it's going to fix it. But because we're exposed to so many other things,
right? Environmentally,
pesticides, stress and anxiety rates, processed diets that we're now all eating versus 80s and late 70s. So it's like so many of these things, multifactorial. So if you're an individual dealing with some of these bowel issues, again, I'm not saying that this is your answer, but it can be a piece to the puzzle for you. Because again, around the time these things were coming on board in large scale, has been a significant increase in these diseases that, again, may be a contributing factor, especially because the crops that I named, again, this wasn't, tomatoes and broccoli. Like, yeah, we all eat some tomatoes and broccoli.
Right.
This is potatoes, corn, soy. So even think about processed foods, cornmeal, corn syrup, corn starch, corn flour, all those things. You don't think I'm eating corn, high fructose corn syrup, but the source of it, the amount of it that we consume. For a non-meat eater, the amount of soy they consume. So when you look at this, such a significant impact to your diet can be done by altering these foods. It may not affect the vast majority of us. It may not affect us at all, for all we know, for sure. But there's, again, a similar theme here. There's definitely plenty of smoke that this can be a contributing factor, given what they saw in the rats, given around this time what we have seen increase. Again, just potentially a piece of the puzzle for you as you're trying to make your individual decisions.
Lots of correlation, lots of smoke around these sorts of issues.
So, and the other thing I have to touch on is cancer risk. That is something that, from what I found, I could not find a study that I was comfortable with that really showed that there was an increased cancer risk. That said, what a lot of the conclusions kind of added, and which is absolutely true, is when you're dealing with something like cancer, and maybe you're talking about not something that's, so clearly going to cause the issue soon. Right. You're dealing with something that you're getting these subtle amounts of these proteins that aren't normally in corn, et cetera.
Right.
So when you're dealing with something like that, these studies need to be done much longer term. And even though these GMOs have been around since the 90s, we still don't have long-term studies comparing. And then even at that, whenever you do get them, there's so many other factors. The people who are eating GMO foods are just more likely eating corn byproducts. They're not maybe eating whole fruits, whole vegetables. So you've got this kind of confluence of things that complicates this so much. If you're on the side that, hey, I know these things are bad and I saw this study and I believe this one, that's fine again. But whenever you're analyzing things like this with so many factors that can be at play, not just in what we're exposed to over the last few decades, but in what comes along with that. So again, the GMO consumption comes with a lot of other things that can be harmful.
Right.
Yeah. And just regarding that, because a lot of that comes from this theory that we're changing our genes. So we're changing the genes of this plant. There's genetic mutations. Now this plant is more likely to have these mutations. We're eating them. Our genes can mutate. There was a very specific study done, which I definitely thought was interesting. They isolated the protein that was produced by the GMO potato. So it was the one that was meant to be produced. It was the one that was genetically modified to produce.
Yep.
They gave the rat this potato daily. Okay. There were multiple rats. They found no evidence of the protein in the rat. So the consumption can affect you, but the consumption is not necessarily even entering your body or bloodstream, let alone causing genetic mutations and changes. So, but that is something that's out there again when you start looking up these things. Again, these GMO products produce given proteins, okay? And they've analyzed that those proteins are not, they're passed and that they're not consumed from the standpoint of that it would cause those effects in you. That
makes sense. I mean, these companies are trying to make profit, but they're not trying to kill the people that are buying their product.
True. And again, back to the whole, cancer evidence is going to need to be decades long.
I was going to say, yeah.
So even at that, there may be no intention, but it still could be an outcome. But there's no evidence that the genetic modification of that substance that you then consume is even found in your bloodstream out there to have this effect, let alone causing any changes in our genes.
So long term, 20 years, 50 years, 100 years from now, this may be one of those questions that is fully answered,
yes,
totally fleshed out, and we can confidently say, those were fine, these were not, or horrible idea from start to finish, or you guys freaked out over nothing, it was totally fine.
Wasn't that crazy they were allowed to do that back in the 2020? Exactly. That's where my mind goes with it too.
But not today.
But not today. We can't say that today.
Man. Why isn't science faster? Okay. All right. This is all wonderful, uplifting news. Joey, I love our time together. Every time we get together, you tell me all the reasons I can't eat all the things I want to eat, the cheap food. What's the punchline here? I mean, aside from the optics, you were saying there's new gene expression, allergies, cancer concerns, and of course the environmental risks. But at the same time, let me give the pro GMO argument. What about, crops that are drought resistant? If we can genetically modify a staple food to be able to be grown in an environment where it typically struggles, so that people in sub-Saharan Africa can have plenty of food and not die of starvation, isn't that better than the alternative?
Absolutely. And I think that goes to one of the main points I had in here, kind of in the wrap up. Individual regulation. I talked about it before. GMOs as a whole, again, whatever opinion you have is fine. But what ultimately matters is this individual genetic modification and this individual plant that produces this specific protein. What can that do to me?
Got it.
That's ultimately, I think, where the research is done. I mean, when we talked about the regulations, that is where it's done.
Yeah.
So that's critical to me. That type of thinking, that this is not necessarily a bad or harmful thing across the board, but the amount of GMOs within the same species, how many different modifications have been done to corn, like we talked about,
right,
potatoes. So and then how do you do a study for 20 years showing that this type of corn GMO can cause this and this one doesn't? It's very complicated.
Yeah.
So I know in some ways I'm saying two different things. There's no exact answer here. I just don't think it's necessary to, as a blanket, say that GMOs are absolutely bad, that they're not doing any good, and they must be avoided at all costs. I think that blanket is much too strong. Now, if you have, for example, you have gut issues, that's more of a direct cause and effect. God forbid you get cancer 30 years from now. You don't necessarily know where that came from, and hopefully we will find out if these are causing it. Believe me, I think there's
right.
But when something like that, where you can have a little more of a direct cause and effect, somebody with IBS, and like I talked about before, I'm not saying that this is your answer, and I also like the things that come along with it. So if you eliminate some GMOs, you are more likely eating quality fruits and vegetables. You are looking at your overall pesticide residue exposure. That goes down. So, and organic is not the be all end all here. I just like the hormone topic, like the pesticide topic. GMOs are not permitted in organic food.
I was just going to ask that.
Yes.
So if it's organic, it is not bioengineered.
Correct. There's one little nuance. I had this up there earlier and I missed it. 100% organic is what it says, but organic can be up to 5% GMO. Whatever that's worth to you. I know, I couldn't believe it.
Wait. Okay. Say that again.
You have to redact your last statement now.
100% organic is its own label or description that would be on a package. That is accurate for all we know. Regular organic, just this product is organic, just the regular organic stamp, 95%. So there still could be some GMOs. Now they're approved, they're individually looked at, all those things, but they technically can still be in there.
So there's now levels to organic.
Yeah.
There's 100% organic versus possibly 95% organic.
I found that very surprising too.
Oh man. And look, the reducing the amount is, 95% is better than 50%.
It is.
But that's still really frustrating. Okay. So organic means at least 95%. If it says 100% organic, that means it is 100% organic.
Yeah, so be careful with that. There is, like Josiah talked about earlier, there is a non-GMO, certification that you can get on your food as well. I don't think any of these things have any downside. Back to the organic. There's a financial constraint. There are, when you go out to eat and all those different things, there's access constraints for various people. But it is one way to cut down the risk. Back to the smoke or fire. I don't know that there's fire, but there's maybe some smoke, and that you're maybe supporting a smaller farm. You're doing all these maybe little different things that, hey, it's worth it for me to do.
Right.
And in particular, if you've got the inflammatory, irritable bowel diseases, particularly if you've had a history of anaphylactic reactions. You have a lot of different allergies. You have a lot of different food insensitivities. I think those all kind of would raise the bar potentially for what you can do. And going into a conventional grocery store with no organic food is just going to make that very difficult. How do I know which apples to get? If it's organic, you do. If it's not organic, probably is GMO, but you don't know. So I don't mean to always sound like so pro-organic, especially whenever a lot of these things we are discussing are not 100% conclusive, but it does cut down on the risk of all those GMO hormone pesticides that we've been discussing. It cuts down whatever risk is there, it cuts it down dramatically.
Okay. All right. So to wrap up then, you're saying there's smoke, but there's we don't know that there's fire.
Mm-hmm.
You're saying there are lots of potential issues. Who knows at this point? Research is ongoing. But that if you are someone who is already dealing with a lot of these issues, that this is an excellent place to start making some changes in the hopes of mitigating any effects they may be having.
Yes, it could be something for you to try. And I think be remiss to not mention that if your avoidance of GMOs causes you to eat less plant food, less fruits, less vegetables, that's a big problem, because we know for certain the science around fruits and vegetables and whole foods. We know that for sure. The GMO stuff we're not as sure about. So if you go so far to the extreme regarding the issue that it cuts down on what we know is good for you, that's a problem. So just be aware of that as well.
So having a hyper processed food that's organic is still not as good as a necessarily non-organic whole food,
especially when you're talking about something like a broccoli or a tomato or peppers that are not. It's not grabbing corn is still maybe a little bit of its own category. But when you're talking about traditional vegetables, yeah, I would totally agree with that.
Okay, all right, Joey. One of these days, I need you to have a show where you're just like, hey, everything's awesome, and we're good.
We'll have to do that.
Nothing to worry about.
Is there anything you can do to mitigate GMOs in your diet?
You can't wash them out. If you scrub your vegetables.
No, that's a good question though. It's literally choosing non-GMO options. There's no like supplements or different foods you can intake. There's no exercise routine that's going to make you more likely to get rid of them, things like that. Those things are all good, but they're not going to. This is a source black or white situation in terms of your level of concern with GMOs.
Well, check back with us in about 50 years when we have the conclusive data on all of this. We'll see how right we were or wrong. All right. All of that said, that's
stay away from the tacos.
Yeah.
I guess.
Don't go to chain taco places. Come on.
Starlink.
You know better than that.
Starlink corn.
Starlink corn.
If you would like to get some whole healthy supplements made from non-GMO products, Everything on our website, you want to go check it out. AskJoeDiMatteo.com, AskJoeDiMatteo.com. You can find all of our products there. You can find the newsletter. You can sign up for our newsletter and find out what's on sale when things go on sale. Past episodes of this show, the show that started all of this, the Ask Joe DiMatteo show, all there on the website. Go check it out. If you have a question, if you want to know more about any of these topics or anything else, shoot us an email. questions@askjoedimatteo.com. That is AskJoeDiMatteo.com. Show notes, all the articles and studies that Joey mentioned, those are going to be available down below. Big thanks, Josiah Schweinberg, engineer extraordinaire, Michael Deppish, our editor, Joyce Gibb, nurse practitioner, who handles all of our private consultations. If you have issues, give her a shout. She can help you out. Oh, that rhymed. I didn't do that on purpose. Okay. Diane Silverman manages our product. Terry does scheduling. Cecilia does distribution. That's Joey DiMatteo. I'm Tyler Andrews. Thanks so much, guys. We'll see you next time.